If you've ever heard of the Cannes Film Festival, or have seen beautiful pictures of French beaches, chances are you've seen glimpses of southern France, the subject of today's lecture. Here is another region that has set benchmarks for wines around the world. For today's lecture, you'll need the following wines: a white wine from the Rhone Valley. You'll also need rosés either from Côte de Provence or from Tavel in the Rhone. A northern Rhone Syrah. This one's from Hermitage, but Gros Hermitage or Saint-Joseph or Cornas work. A Côte du Rhône from southern Rhone, as well as a Châteauneuf-du-Pape from southern Rhone, and a Languedoc, a red Languedoc. The first recorded noteworthy French wines in history didn't come from Bordeaux, or Burgundy, or Champagne. They came from the Rhone Valley. Pliny, the first century Roman author and naturalist, stated that wines produced in Vienna, modern Vienne in the Rhone Valley, were excellent, high-priced, and a source of national pride for the people who lived there. Fortunately, the Romans could easily transport wines from the Rhone Valley because the Rhone River flows south to the Mediterranean. The Rhone Valley is treated as one region, but it consists of two sections: the northern Rhone and the southern Rhone. The northern Rhone Valley wines are some of the highest quality, or I should say, have the best reputations of the entire Rhone Valley. The climate is continental, although there is some Mediterranean influence. The valley is quite steep and narrow in the northern Rhone, so the vines are generally staked to a single post. The main grape varieties there include 3 white grapes, Viognier, Marsanne, and Roussanne, and 1 red grape variety, Syrah. If you have a Viognier, do your chest, chin, and nose test. Is it aromatic? It should be. Now, the fruits that you get in Viognier are quite round and quite big. It'll probably be reminiscent of stone fruit, peaches, apricots. But the marker that you get for Viognier is white flowers. Viognier is also known for having low acid and a voluptuous body. It's pretty big. In the Languedoc, it's generally unoaked, but in the northern Rhone, in the region of Condrieu, it is oaked, which gives it a soft and creamy type of texture. And when it gets older, you get a more beeswax, kind of more spicy tone. You also see this grape in the Languedoc, which we'll talk about later. In the Languedoc, it's generally unoaked and appreciated for its youthful, fruity, and floral character. The other white varieties you see in the northern Rhone, Marsanne and Roussanne, are rarely seen apart and make up the white wines of white Hermitage and white Gros Hermitage. Roussanne can have pear aromas and something a bit herbal, while Marsanne adds a floral or jasmine and stone fruit flavor. Remember about apricots and peaches. Marsanne has a tendency to get a little blousy. Remember, this describes a wine with lower acid and fuller weight. This is why its thinner sister Roussanne is generally blended in with it for the bustier Marsanne to balance it out. Now let's go to the reds. As we discussed in Lecture 6, Syrah is known for strong red raspberry aromas with notes of black pepper spice. The Northern Rhone is one benchmark and a traditional style for Syrah, where it can be particularly deep, dark, rich, and meaty. The most northern region within the Northern Rhone, known for red, is Côte Rôtie. This means roasted coast or roasted slope in French. And it's so named because of its intense sun exposure. The vineyards here are so steep that the berries must be picked by hands, and the vines are posted on stakes. However, the north wind that blows through the Northern Rhone, and even stronger in the Southern Rhone, is called le Mistral, keeps these grapes cool at night and reduces berry size. Smaller berries means smaller pulp-to-skin ratio, which means more intense color and richness. If you have a Côte Rôtie as your example of Northern Rhone, you'll notice that it's really deep ruby color. And most examples are fairly opaque. You can't see your fingers through it. Côte Rôtie is unique among the reds of the Northern Rhone as it's a blend. It's here that Syrah is blended with up to 20% Viognier. It was probably added traditionally to soften some of the robust richness and gripping tannins of Syrah, which is, because it's so far up north in the Rhone Valley, although Viognier also adds an aromatic lift and elegance to the wine. On the palate, Côte Rôtie is full-bodied, rich, meaty, and can even have the aromas of roasted meat, like with hints of rosemary, like an entire feast unto itself. If it's a youthful vintage, then the tannins are really quite dense and gripping, though again, this is generally not as gripping as Cab. Then there is Hermitage, which we have here. It's the most famous and generally regarded as the highest quality appellation with the longest lived wines in the entire Rhone Valley. The name Hermitage comes from a legend from the 13th century Crusades. A wounded knight came back from the Crusades, sought refuge on this very hill surrounded by vines, and lived there as a hermit, Hermitage. A chapel of St. Christopher still stands near the top of the hill of Hermitage today. The hill of Hermitage is where the best wines come from, especially on the southwest-facing slopes, where the soils of granite retain a lot of the sun's warmth throughout the day. Unlike with Côte Rôtie, the wines of Hermitage are generally pure Syrah. Unlike in Bordeaux and Burgundy, there is no strict classification here. However, there are climats. A climat is a specific vineyard known for its high quality and unique characteristics within an appellation such as Hermitage, and you'll see this on the label. Now let's taste the Hermitage. You'll notice it has a very deep color. Again, not as deep as Cab, but sometimes it can get quite inky, and I've seen ones that almost look black, and you can definitely not see your fingers through it. Now let's do the aroma test. Definitely get a lot of raspberry aromas, which is what Syrah is known for. And in Hermitage, you get a lot of smoke and minerals and herbal characteristics such as rosemary. This is because you can find a lot of these herbs all throughout the region. In Hermitage, as opposed to, let's say, Crozes Hermitage, you're getting a lot more dark fruits as well. So in addition to the raspberry fruit, you may be getting something like blackberries. Now let's taste it. It's full-bodied, powerfully firm tannins, but it's got balanced level of acidity as well. And the alcohol is a little bit warmer. You can definitely tell this is from a southern region, a warmer climate than what we were dealing with before. You can tell this also needs some time because it's tightly knit at the moment. And what I mean by that is that the fruit is kind of competing with the tannins at the moment, and it's not breaking apart, and it's not elegant yet. So it's a little bit tight. It needs some time to loosen up. It's also got a high level of oak to it. And you can tell because it's got a lot of toasty aromas. And you still also get some of that vanilla spice as well. But it's very complex because you taste the fruit, you taste the smoke, the minerals, the rosemary, a little bit of, almost tastes like a meatiness that has there. And also, notice I've been talking for quite some time. Notice the flavor is still lasting in your mouth. It is in mine. Now, Crozes Hermitage is the Northern Rhone's largest volume wine producer. But that doesn't say very much, as they still produce very tiny quantities of wine. But they share some similar characteristics, similar aroma and flavor, like raspberry, spice, rosemary, but it's a little bit lighter in body and tannin, which, with its more obvious fruit, is more approachable in its youth, like a baby Hermitage. Crozes Hermitage is more moderate to Hermitage's high prices and can be a definite great value. The regions of Saint-Joseph and Cornas are also great values, also made of Syrah, with the aromas of raspberry and spice, but also with something a bit more rustic. What do I mean by that? Have you heard that term, rustic? Now, think of the tannins that you've tasted in your mouth. And something like the Hermitage, it is powerful, but they are quite fine. And when we were talking about Bordeaux, they were also powerful, but they were velvety. Now, when I say rustic, I mean that the tannins are a bit more coarse they are less refined, and the aromas that you get are more earthy. Imagine walking through the woods, let's say on a damp day, and you can smell the damp earth and some of the damp leaves. That's what I mean by more of an earthy kind of character. And that's what I mean by rustic. Again, not necessarily a bad thing, and it can add layers of complexity. But these regions are definite great values for Old World classics. Now we come to the southern Rhone, which is much larger and produces a lot more wine. As the Rhone River flows south towards the Mediterranean, the structure of the valley changes from the steep high valley of the northern Rhone with its steep slopes, and it flattens out towards the southern Rhone. Much of this land is fields of herbs called garrigues, where the winds blow their spicy scent across the vineyards and you can smell these herbs in the wines. The climate here is quite Mediterranean, meaning it's rainly mostly in the winter and both milder and warmer than the northern Rhone region. The northern Mistral wind, remember the wind, however, is very strong here. And while that helps keep away fungal disease, it can cause a lot of wind damage, which is the reason why the vines are not trained along wires, but instead are trained low to the ground and leaning into the wind in a bush style they call gobelet. The terrain is characterized by these large rounded stones called galets. They can be several inches across, actually. They retain heat very, very well and reflect the heat up onto the low-trained vines during the day and during the night. There are dozens of grape varieties permitted here, although the most important and predominant grape variety here is Grenache. Grenache is also called Garnacha in Spain, and it's a noble grape variety, although we really didn't have time to discuss it in Lecture 6. However, Southern Rhone is its benchmark. Grenache, while a full-bodied red variety, is fairly pale in color. My benchmark for Grenache is a juicy sweet cherry, kind of like a cherry-flavored hard candy. However, similar to Syrah, it has its own spice, but instead of black pepper spice, it's more of a note of licorice. And unlike the other red grape varieties we've looked at so far, Grenache is a red grape variety that is low in acid, but it's quite high in alcohol. This grape is a beach bunny. It loves the sun, and Grenache produces quite a bit of sugar, which translates into that high level of alcohol. The best-known region of the Southern Rhone for this is Châteauneuf-du-Pape, which translates into the new castle or the new house of the Pope in French. And you'll notice on all the bottles of Châteauneuf-du-Pape, we have a white Châteauneuf-du-Pape here and a red Châteauneuf-du-Pape over here. You'll notice the papal seal on the label, or on the bottle itself. Actually, it's raised. And this refers to the relocation of the papal court to Avignon in the Southern Rhone in the 14th century. Now here I have a Châteauneuf-du-Pape, a red Châteauneuf-du-Pape. There are 13 grape varieties, red and white, that are permitted here. Now notice that it's a medium ruby color. And if you want, you can compare it to the Hermitage, and you'll notice it's paler. This is what I was talking to you about, saying that it is paler than Syrah. Now let's do the chest, chin, nose test. While not overly aromatic, you do get this overwhelming sense that it's seen a lot of sunshine, because you get very juicy, ripe fruit, almost like jam, like strawberry jam or cherry jam. And sometimes you can get a note of candied cherry lifesavers. But you also get layers of flavors, that complexities of licorice and cinnamon, but also minerals and that garrigue. But you also get the toastiness and the vanilla of French oak. So let's taste it. It's very rich and concentrated in its fruit, but you definitely notice the low acid in comparison to the wines we were tasting before. The tannins are firm, but they're very, very fine, so they're the opposite, of course, And there's, like I said, there's many layers of complexity here with the fruit, the herbs, the minerals, the vanilla, the toast. It just goes on and on and on. It has a really long finish as well. If you have a gigondas, the flavors are fairly similar, though gigondas will be a bit more rustic and earthy, and it lacks the finesse and the power that is Châteauneuf-du-Pape. It's the same with the region of Vacqueyras as well. Côte du Rhone generally has a higher percentage of other grape varieties blended in, such as Mourvèdre and Cinsault, which add color and acidity, respectively. And they're usually the more moderately priced within the region. Here we have a Côte du Rhone, and what I'd like for you to do is pick up, if you have it, the Côte du Rhone versus the Châteauneuf-du-Pape. In the examples that I have here, the Côte du Rhone actually is a little bit lighter than the Châteauneuf-du-Pape, but that's not always the case. The Côte du Rhone has, again, some things blended into it that give it a little bit more color. Now let's smell it. Yeah, much more herbal now. Many more layers of types of herbs, but less on the vanilla and the toast. This is a bit simpler than the Châteauneuf-du-Pape. You still get that juicy fruit, but you don't get that layer of depth to it. Again, you see a little bit of the low acid, but it's a bit higher than the Châteauneuf-du-Pape. Again, this comes to the higher percentages of other grape varieties that are blended into it. And it's really quite nice. This is a great wine for casual restaurants that you can order and still order a classic wine from France. And they're really very well priced. On the opposite side of the Rhone River from Châteauneuf-du-Pape is a region called Tavel. Here, the limestone soil helps the wines retain acidity, as well as helps the grapes ripen. Here's one of the best French dry rosés made in the entire country. Now, according to legend, King Philippe le Bel of France in the 13th century traveled through Tavel and remarked that there is no good wine except for Tavel. It was also a favored wine of Louis XIV. I've mentioned him quite a bit, haven't I? I guess he must have drunk a lot. In the US, unfortunately, we tend to think of rosé wine as blush, meaning cheap, sweet, pink stuff. Now, I'm not knocking blush, as I still enjoy it. However, dry rosés can still be some of the best wines to drink during the summer and the spring that you can find. They're beautifully fruity, and the ones from the southern France have much more complexity and finesse. They're also incredibly food-friendly and have great versatility, which we'll talk about in lecture 24. They're made with many grape varieties of the area, including Grenache, Mourvèdre, Cinsault, and Syrah, and some white grape varieties such as Clairette and Bourbon. Rosés are made by allowing the juice to sit with the skins for some hours. The longer it sits, the more color it gets. Tavel sits from anywhere 12 to 36 hours, depending on the vintage. Now you're going to notice here we have two rosés. The one I have on the right is Tavel. The one I have on my left, if I'm facing it, is the Côte de Provence. Now, you'll probably see that the Tavel is a little bit deeper in color. That's probably because it spent more time sitting on the skins than the Côte de Provence. Now, an additional method for making rosé include bleeding the juice off the vats of crushed red grapes. The juice is left in the vats after bleeding some of it out, and it's left there to macerate. This method of bleeding is called saigner, or bled in French. Lastly, a way to make rosé is to add colored juice back prior to fermentation, or wine, red wine, after fermentation. So why would they add the juice before? Well, Tavel is a dry wine, and if the juice was added after fermentation, it would be sweet. You would be able to tell. Now, in general, more modern techniques ferment rosés at lower temperatures to retain the fruitiness, as these wines are intended to be consumed young. Most Tavel and Provence rosés are fermented completely bone dry. So if you pick one up expecting it to be sugary sweet, you're going to be disappointed. However, the wines have a sweet impression of fruitiness that can seem sweet on the palate. Remember from lecture 2, you can test to see if it's sweet? You know, remember the hold your nose while you taste test? Your tongue doesn't lie. Now here we have a Tavel. Notice its gorgeous salmon pink color. And you can pick it up and compare it to the Provence Rosé. Definitely deeper in color. They're just such pretty wines. Now let's taste it. I mean, immediately you get strawberries and watermelon kind of aromas and even a hint of cranberry, but you definitely get that dried herbal character, and it adds some complexity to it. And you also get some minerality there as well. Wow, just tasting this reminds me of summer automatically. On the palate, it's dry, but it's fresh, it's fruity, you're getting layers in there, it's got some depth. I mean, I could be on a beach somewhere being perfectly happy with this wine. Between the cities of Marseille and Nice, along the southern French coast, is a region called Provence. Because of 3,000 hours of sunshine a year, little rainfall and the Le Mistral wind, it's a prime location for organic viniculture, which we'll look at in more detail in lecture 17. Provence is also famous for its rosé. You'll probably see Provence rosé on a wine list more often than you're going to see Tavel, just because Tavel is made in such tiny quantities, and there's more Provence rosé made. It too is made of Grenache, Cinsault, Mourvèdre, and has similar characteristics, yet it has a little bit more of a lavender note, as it grows so prevalently there. Now we go on to the Languedoc, home of France's best value wines, largest wine-producing region, and pioneers in winemaking. With its warm Mediterranean climate, it has very ripe fruit, and many of the producers there are experimenting with new technologies. It's like the California of France, and there are some great values to be had. The Languedoc takes its name from a time when its inhabitants spoke Occitan, which, the name, the Languedoc, language of the Occitan. However, this is also the place where France has wine terrorists, believe it or not, called CRAV, which stands for Le Comité Régional d'Action Viticole, Regional Committee for Viticultural Action. Now, back in March of 2009, they slipped into a cooperative group in Nimes, pulled out the plugs from some vats, and emptied the equivalent of 1.2 million bottles of wine onto the premises, from where it seeped out into the adjacent river. They strike for various reasons, such as the government won't provide enough subsidies, or because there's competition from foreign wine, which doesn't necessarily mean it's from outside the country. Foreign to them could mean a neighboring wine region within France. This is not unlike what you see in Bordeaux, where the growers kind of riot against the brokers. In 2006, one particular Bordeaux broker sold a barrel for wine for under the minimum agreed price, which totally incensed the winemakers. So in the wee hours in the morning, before the broker got to the office, they dumped 1 ton or 2,200 pounds of manure in front of his office, preventing anyone from getting inside. Now, I also remember reading a few years ago when they went one step further, where they broke into the broker's office, filled it with manure, and then bricked up the walls and the windows. Can you imagine how that smelled? But in the Languedoc, the activists are much more serious and dangerous. This group has been known to riot, to hijack tankers of foreign wine, and dynamite government buildings or supermarkets. The land here in the Languedoc is quite flat and stretches across flat plains. The soil in this region is so varied it's tough to generalize. However, the plains and valleys have alluvial soils, which make the wines more approachable, and the hillsides are schist or limestone. Going a little inland, and especially on the hillsides, you have a great sun exposure and drainage for more concentrated wines. In regard to modern techniques, there's been an influx of Australian winemakers in the last decade or so. This, along with a general excitement towards modern technology and building on traditional practices, is changing the image of this region, which used to be regarded only as producing cheap jug wine. However, a majority of the wine made in this region is still labeled the lower quality tiers of vin de pays and vin de table. They have a larger supply than demand issue, and as a result, the government has tried to take steps to give incentives for growers to pull up vines and to stop producing. And though some of them have, it hasn't been enough, and they call it the wine lake. They do have some appellations that are devoted to quality, including Corbière, Minervois, Fitou, and Fougères, to name a few. However, we don't see a ton of them here in the US. They're also known for some vin doux naturel, sweet fortified wines similar to port, such as Bagnols, which you'll see on dessert wine lists sometimes. It's somewhat lighter than port and can be a great value at a restaurant at the end of a meal. Here we have a wine from Ma Belle Zo, a producer in the Côte de Languedoc region in the Rhone. Eau is the word for water in French, and the wine takes its name from the numerous water springs which bubble to the surface around there. It's an SGM, what we say in the industry, for a blend of Syrah, Grenache, and Mourvèdre, as well as it has a grape called Carignan in it. Now, let's take a look at the color of this wine. It's quite deep, actually. And it's slightly opaque. I can barely see my fingers through it. Not incredibly aromatic, but what I do get is some dark cherry notes, a hint of raspberry, and you definitely get a mineral character there. But instead of rosemary, I get more sage notes, and I still get a little bit of black pepper. But what I do get is something, what I call bramble, which is a woodsy or a bark. You'll see this in Spain as well, and I'll talk about bramble aromas. And you may see it in reviews as well. Now let's taste it. Definitely not a cool climate wine. It's got some ripe, juicy fruit in there. And the acid's quite balanced. It's not very low, but it is quite balanced. But you got some really ripe tannins in there. And they're quite dense as well. It's rich. And you notice some of the same complexities that you had on the nose in the palate. And at about $20 a bottle, this is an incredible value. So keep an eye on this area, because every year, the wines from these regions get better and better. Well, I've taken you through the benchmarks of French grape varieties and classic regions. This will help build your foundation of understanding when we come to other regions, starting with Italy in the next lecture. If you thought France is confusing with its laws and regions, just wait. Italy can be a bear to learn about because they have their own laws, but they're not always consistently applied. However, seeing as most of us love Italian food, nothing goes better with the food than the wines from the same regions. You will need the following wines for the next lecture. Here we have the wines from Piemonte. So we have a Gavi, as well as a Barbera d'Asti. And you get a Nebbiolo-based wine. So Barolo, Barbaresco, Langhe. So those are Nebbiolo-based wines from Piemonte. And now we go off to northeastern Italy, where we have Pinot Grigio. Yeah, I know you've heard that one before. Soave, which is from the Veneto, and either a Valpolicella or an Amarone. Piemontese wines make the transition from French to Italian easier for you. And the wines of northeastern Italy are some of the most popular in this country, although you may not even know it. Lastly, One of the wines in our next lecture, when combined with a particular dish, touches everything that your tongue can feel, an incredible sensual experience. And until then, merci beaucoup and à più tardi.